1910.1027, Cadmium. Scope. This standard applies to all occupational exposures to cadmium and cadmium compounds, in all forms, and in all industries covered by the Occupational Safety and Health Act, except the construction-related industries, which are covered under 29 CFR 1926.63. 1910.1027, B. Definitions. Action level, AL, is defined as an airborne concentration of cadmium of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA. Assistant Secretary means the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, U.S. Department of Labor, or designee. Authorized person means any person authorized by the employer and required by work duties to be present in regulated areas, or any person authorized by the OSHA Act or regulations issued under it to be in regulated areas. Director means the Director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or designee. Employee exposure and similar language referring to the air cadmium level to which an employee is exposed means the exposure to airborne cadmium that would occur if the employee were not using respiratory protective equipment. Final medical determination is the written medical opinion of the employee's health status by the examining physician under paragraphs L3-12 of this section, or, if multiple physician review, under paragraph L13 of this section, or the alternative physician determination under paragraph L14 of this section is invoked, it is the final, written medical finding, recommendation or determination that emerges from that process. High-efficiency particulate air, HEPA, filter means a filter capable of trapping and retaining at least 99.97% of monodispersed particles of 0.3 micrometers in diameter. Regulated area means an area demarcated by the employer where an employee's exposure to airborne concentrations of cadmium exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the permissible exposure limit, PL. This section means this cadmium standard. 1910.1027, C. Permissible exposure limit, PEL. The employer shall assure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of cadmium in excess of 5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, 5 micrograms per cubic meter, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average exposure, TWA. 1910.1027, D. Exposure monitoring. 1910.1027, D1, General. 1910.1027, D1, I, through 1910.1027, D1, 3, each employer who has a workplace or work operation covered by this section shall determine if any employee may be exposed to cadmium at or above the action level. Determinations of employee exposure shall be made from breathing zone air samples that reflect the monitored employee's regular, daily 8-hour TWA exposure to cadmium. 8-hour TWA exposures shall be determined for each employee on the basis of one or more personal breathing zone air samples reflecting full shift exposure on each shift, for each job classification, in each work area. Where several employees perform the same job tasks, in the same job classification, on the same shift, in the same work area, and the length, duration, and level of cadmium exposures are similar, an employer may sample a representative fraction of the employees instead of all employees in order to meet this requirement. In representative sampling, the employer shall sample the employees expected to have the highest cadmium exposures. 1910.1027, D2, Specific. 1910.1027, D2, I, through 1910.1027, D2, 3, Initial Monitoring. Except as provided for in paragraphs D2, 2, and D2, 3 of this section, the employer shall monitor employee exposures and shall base initial determinations on the monitoring results. Where the employer has monitored after September 14, 1991, under conditions that in all important aspects closely resemble those currently prevailing, and where that monitoring satisfies all other requirements of this section, including the accuracy and confidence levels of paragraph D6 of this section, the employer may rely on such earlier monitoring results to satisfy the requirements of paragraph D2I of this section. Where the employer has objective data, as defined in paragraph N2 of this section, demonstrating that employee exposure to cadmium will not exceed the action level under the expected conditions of processing, use, or handling, the employer may rely upon such data instead of implementing initial monitoring. 1910.1027 D3 Monitoring frequency, periodic monitoring. 1910.1027 D3 I If the initial monitoring or periodic monitoring reveals employee exposures to be at or above the action level, the employer shall monitor at a frequency and pattern needed to represent the levels of exposure of employees and where exposures are above the PL to assure the adequacy of respiratory selection and the effectiveness of engineering and work practice controls. However, such exposure monitoring shall be performed at least every 6 months. The employer, at a minimum, shall continue these semi-annual measurements unless and until the conditions set out in paragraph D3(2) of this section are met. 1910.1027 D3(2) If the initial monitoring or the periodic monitoring indicates that employee exposures are below the action level and that result is confirmed by the results of another monitoring taken at least 7 days later, the employer may discontinue the monitoring for those employees whose exposures are represented by such monitoring. 1910.1027 D4 Additional monitoring. The employer also shall institute the exposure monitoring required under paragraphs D2I and D3 of this section whenever there has been a change in the raw materials, equipment, personnel, work practices, or finished products that may result in additional employees being exposed to cadmium at or above the action level or in employees already exposed to cadmium at or above the action level being exposed above the PL, or whenever the employer has any reason to suspect that any other change might result in such further exposure. 1910.1027 D5 Employee notification of monitoring results. 1910.1027 D5 I through 1910.1027 D5 2 The employer must, within 15 working days after the receipt of the results of any monitoring performed under this section, notify each affected employee of these results either individually in writing or by posting the results in an appropriate location that is accessible to employees. Wherever monitoring results indicate that employee exposure exceeds the PL, the employer shall include in the written notice a statement that the PL has been exceeded and a description of the corrective action being taken by the employer to reduce employee exposure to or below the PL. 1910.1027 D6 Accuracy of measurement. The employer shall use a method of monitoring and analysis that has an accuracy of not less than plus or minus 25%, plus or minus 25%, with a confidence level of 95%, for airborne concentrations of cadmium at or above the action level, the permissible exposure limit, PL, and the separate engineering control air limit, SECL. 1910.1027 E Regulated areas. 1910.1027 E1 through 1910.1027 E5 Establishment. The employer shall establish a regulated area wherever an employee's exposure to airborne concentrations of cadmium is, or can reasonably be expected to be in excess of the permissible exposure limit, PL. Demarcation. Regulated areas shall be demarcated from the rest of the workplace in any manner that adequately establishes and alerts employees of the boundaries of the regulated area. Access. Access to regulated areas shall be limited to authorized persons. Provision of respirators. Each person entering a regulated area shall be supplied with and required to use a respirator, selected in accordance with paragraph G2 of this section. Prohibited activities. The employer shall assure that employees do not eat, drink, smoke, chew tobacco or gum, or apply cosmetics in regulated areas, carry the products associated with these activities into regulated areas, or store such products in those areas. 1910.1027 F. Methods of compliance. 1910.1027 F1 Compliance hierarchy. 1910.1027 F1 I. Except as specified in paragraphs F1, 2, 3, and 4 of this section, the employer shall implement engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain employee exposure to cadmium at or below the PL, except to the extent that the employer can demonstrate that such controls are not feasible. 1910.1027 F1, 2 except as specified in paragraphs F, 1, 3, and 4 of this section. In industries where a separate engineering control air limit (CECL) has been specified for particular processes, see Table 1 in this paragraph. F, 1, 2, the employer shall implement engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain employee exposure at or below the CECL, except to the extent that the employer can demonstrate that such controls are not feasible. Table I separate engineering control airborne limits (CECLs) for processes in selected industries. Processes in these industries that are not specified in this table must achieve the PL using engineering controls and work practices as required in F, 1, I. 1910.1027, F, 1, 3, the requirement to implement engineering and work practice controls to achieve the PL or, where applicable, the CECL does not apply where the employer demonstrates the following. 1910.1027, F, 1, 3, A, and B. The employee is only intermittently exposed, and the employee is not exposed above the PL on 30 or more days per year, 12 consecutive months. 1910.1027, F, 1, 4, wherever engineering and work practice controls are required and are not sufficient to reduce employee exposure to or below the PL or, where applicable, the CECL, the employer nonetheless shall implement such controls to reduce exposures to the lowest levels achievable. The employer shall supplement such controls with respiratory protection that complies with the requirements of paragraph G of this section and the PL. 1910.1027, F, 1, V, the employer shall not use employee rotation as a method of compliance. 1910.1027, F, 2, compliance program. 1910.1027, F, 2, I, where the PL is exceeded, the employer shall establish and implement a written compliance program to reduce employee exposure to or below the PL by means of engineering and work practice controls, as required by paragraph F, 1 of this section. To the extent that engineering and work practice controls cannot reduce exposures to or below the PL, the employer shall include in the written compliance program the use of appropriate respiratory protection to achieve compliance with the PL. 1910.1027, F, 2, 2, written compliance programs shall include at least the following. 1910.1027, F, 2, 2, A, through H, a description of each operation in which cadmium is emitted, e.g., machinery used, material processed, controls in place, crew size, employee job responsibilities, operating procedures, and maintenance practices. A description of the specific means that will be employed to achieve compliance, including engineering plans and studies used to determine methods selected for controlling exposure to cadmium, as well as, where necessary, the use of appropriate respiratory protection to achieve the PL. A report of the technology considered in meeting the PL. Air monitoring data that document the sources of cadmium emissions. A detailed schedule for implementation of the program, including documentation such as copies of purchase orders for equipment, construction contracts, etc. A work practice program that includes items required under paragraphs H, I, and J of this section. A written plan for emergency situations, as specified in paragraph H of this section. And other relevant information. 1910.1027, F, 2, 3, the written compliance programs shall be reviewed and updated at least annually, or more often if necessary, to reflect significant changes in the employer's compliance status. 1910.1027, F, 2, 4, written compliance programs shall be provided upon request for examination and copying to affected employees, designated employee representatives as well as to the Assistant Secretary and the Director. 1910.1027, F, 3, mechanical ventilation. 1910.1027, F, 3, I, through 1910.1027, F, 3, 4, when ventilation is used to control exposure, measurements that demonstrate the effectiveness of the system in controlling exposure, such as capture velocity, duct velocity, or static pressure shall be made as necessary to maintain its effectiveness. Measurements of the system's effectiveness in controlling exposure shall be made as necessary within 5 working days of any change in production, process, or control that might result in a significant increase in employee exposure to cadmium. Recirculation of air. If air from exhaust ventilation is recirculated into the workplace, the system shall have a high-efficiency filter and be monitored to assure effectiveness. Procedures shall be developed and implemented to minimize employee exposure to cadmium when maintenance of ventilation systems and changing of filters is being conducted. 1910.1027 G. Respiratory protection. 1910.1027 G1. General. For employees who use respirators required by this section, the employer must provide each employee an appropriate respirator that complies with the requirements of this paragraph. Respirators must be used during 1910.1027 G1 I through 1910.1027 G1 7 periods necessary to install or implement feasible engineering and work practice controls when employee exposure levels exceed the PEL. Maintenance and repair activities, and brief or intermittent operations, for which employee exposures exceed the PL and engineering and work practice controls are not feasible or are not required. Activities in regulated areas specified in paragraph E of this section. Work operations for which the employer has implemented all feasible engineering and work practice controls and such controls are not sufficient to reduce employee exposures to or below the PL. Work operations for which an employee is exposed to cadmium at or above the action level, and the employee requests a respirator. Work operations for which an employee is exposed to cadmium above the PL and engineering controls are not required by paragraph F1(2) of this section. Emergencies. 1910.1027 G2. Respirator Program. 1910.1027 G2 I through 1910.1027 G2 3. The employer must implement a respiratory protection program in accordance with section 1910.134 B through D, except D1, 3, and F through M, which covers each employee required by this section to use a respirator. No employees must use a respirator if, based on their most recent medical examination, the examining physician determines that they will be unable to continue to function normally while using a respirator. If the physician determines that the employee must be limited in, or removed from, their current job because of their inability to use a respirator, the limitation or removal must be in accordance with paragraphs L, 11, and 12 of this section. If an employee has breathing difficulty during fit testing or respirator use, the employer must provide the employee with a medical examination in accordance with paragraph L, 6(2) of this section to determine if the employee can use a respirator while performing the required duties. 1910.1027 G3. Respirator Selection. 1910.1027 G3 I. Employers must 1910.1027 G3 I A through C. Select and provide to employees the appropriate respirators specified in paragraph D3 I A of 29 CFR 1910.134. Provide employees with full facepiece respirators when they experience eye irritation. Provide HEPA filters for powered and non-powered air purifying respirators. 1910.1027 G3 2. The employer must provide an employee with a powered air purifying respirator instead of a negative pressure respirator when an employee who is entitled to a respirator chooses to use this type of respirator and such a respirator provides adequate protection to the employee. 1910.1027 H. Emergency situations. The employer shall develop and implement a written plan for dealing with emergency situations involving substantial releases of airborne cadmium. The plan shall include provisions for the use of appropriate respirators and personal protective equipment. In addition, employees not essential to correcting the emergency situation shall be restricted from the area and normal operations halted in that area until the emergency is abated. 1910.1027 I. Protective work clothing and equipment. 1910.1027 I1. Provision and use. If an employee is exposed to airborne cadmium above the PL or where skin or eye irritation is associated with cadmium exposure at any level, the employer shall provide at no cost to the employee, and assure that the employee uses appropriate protective work clothing and equipment that prevents contamination of the employee and the employee's garments. Protective work clothing and equipment includes, but is not limited to, 1910.1027 I1 I through 1910.1027 I1 3. Coveralls or similar full-body work clothing, gloves, head coverings, and boots or foot coverings, and face shields, vented goggles, or other appropriate protective equipment that complies with 29 CFR 1910.133. 1910.1027 I-2, Removal and Storage. 1910.1027 I-2 I through 1910.1027 I-2 4. The employer shall assure that employees remove all protective clothing and equipment contaminated with cadmium at the completion of the work shift and do so only in change rooms provided in accordance with paragraph J1 of this section. The employer shall assure that no employee takes cadmium-contaminated protective clothing or equipment from the workplace, except for employees authorized to do so for purposes of laundering, cleaning, maintaining, or disposing of cadmium-contaminated protective clothing and equipment at an appropriate location or facility away from the workplace. The employer shall assure that contaminated protective clothing and equipment, when removed for laundering, cleaning, maintenance, or disposal, is placed and stored in sealed, impermeable bags or other closed, impermeable containers that are designed to prevent dispersion of cadmium dust. The employer shall assure that bags or containers of contaminated protective clothing and equipment that are to be taken out of the change rooms or the workplace for laundering, cleaning, maintenance, or disposal shall bear labels in accordance with paragraph M3 of this section. 1910.1027 I-3, Cleaning, Replacement, and Disposal. 1910.1027 I-3 I through 1910.1027 I-3 The employer shall provide the protective clothing and equipment required by paragraph I-1 of this section in a clean and dry condition as often as necessary to maintain its effectiveness, but in any event at least weekly. The employer is responsible for cleaning and laundering the protective clothing and equipment required by this paragraph to maintain its effectiveness and is also responsible for disposing of such clothing and equipment. The employer also is responsible for repairing or replacing required protective clothing and equipment as needed to maintain its effectiveness. When rips or tears are detected while an employee is working, they shall be immediately mended, or the worksuit shall be immediately replaced. The employer shall prohibit the removal of cadmium from protective clothing and equipment by blowing, shaking, or any other means that disperses cadmium into the air. The employer shall assure that any laundering of contaminated clothing or cleaning of contaminated equipment in the workplace is done in a manner that prevents the release of airborne cadmium in excess of the permissible exposure limit prescribed in paragraph C of this section. The employer shall inform any person who launders or cleans protective clothing or equipment contaminated with cadmium of the potentially harmful effects of exposure to cadmium and that the clothing and equipment should be laundered or cleaned in a manner to effectively prevent the release of airborne cadmium in excess of the PL. 1910.1027 J. Hygiene Areas and Practices. 1910.1027 J1 General. For employees whose airborne exposure to cadmium is above the PL, the employer shall provide clean change rooms, hand-washing facilities, showers, and lunchroom facilities that comply with 29 CFR 1910.141. 1910.1027 J2 Change Rooms. The employer shall assure that change rooms are equipped with separate storage facilities for street clothes and for protective clothing and equipment, which are designed to prevent dispersion of cadmium and contamination of the employee's street clothes. 1910.1027 J3 Showers and hand-washing facilities. 1910.1027 J3 I through 2 The employer shall assure that employees who are exposed to cadmium above the PL shower during the end of the work shift. The employer shall assure that employees whose airborne exposure to cadmium is above the PL wash their hands and faces prior to eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, or applying cosmetics. 1910.1027 J4 Lunchroom Facilities. 1910.1027 J4 I through 2 The employer shall assure that the lunchroom facilities are readily accessible to employees, that tables for eating are maintained free of cadmium, and that no employee in a lunchroom facility is exposed at any time to cadmium at or above a concentration of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter. The employer shall assure that employees do not enter lunchroom facilities with protective work clothing or equipment unless surface cadmium has been removed from the clothing and equipment by HEPA vacuuming or some other method that removes cadmium dust without dispersing it. 1910.1027 K. Housekeeping. 1910.1027, K1 through K7, all surfaces shall be maintained as free as practicable of accumulations of cadmium. All spills and sudden releases of material containing cadmium shall be cleaned up as soon as possible. Surfaces contaminated with cadmium shall, wherever possible, be cleaned by vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood of cadmium becoming airborne. HEPA-filtered vacuuming equipment or equally effective filtration methods shall be used for vacuuming. The equipment shall be used and emptied in a manner that minimizes the re-entry of cadmium into the workplace. Shoveling, dry or wet sweeping, and brushing may be used only where vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood of cadmium becoming airborne have been tried and found not to be effective. Compressed air shall not be used to remove cadmium from any surface unless the compressed air is used in conjunction with a ventilation system designed to capture the dust cloud created by the compressed air. Waste, scrap, debris, bags, containers, personal protective equipment, and clothing contaminated with cadmium and consigned for disposal shall be collected and disposed of in sealed impermeable bags or other closed, impermeable containers. These bags and containers shall be labeled in accordance with paragraph M of this section. 1910.1027, L. Medical surveillance. 1910.1027, L1, General. 1910.1027, L1I, Scope. 1910.1027, L1I, A, through B. Currently exposed, the employer shall institute a medical surveillance program for all employees who are or may be exposed to cadmium at or above the action level unless the employer demonstrates that the employee is not, and will not be, exposed at or above the action level on 30 or more days per year, 12 consecutive months, and previously exposed, the employer shall also institute a medical surveillance program for all employees who prior to the effective date of this section might previously have been exposed to cadmium at or above the action level by the employer. Unless the employer demonstrates that the employee did not prior to the effective date of this section work for the employer in jobs with exposure to cadmium for an aggregated total of more than 60 months. 1910.1027, L1, 2. To determine an employee's fitness for using a respirator, the employer shall provide the limited medical examination specified in paragraph L6 of this section. 1910.1027, L1, 3. The employer shall assure that all medical examinations and procedures required by this standard are performed by or under the supervision of a licensed physician, who has read and is familiar with the health effects section of Appendix A to this section, the regulatory text of this section, the protocol for sample handling and laboratory selection in Appendix F to this section, and the questionnaire of Appendix D to this section. These examinations and procedures shall be provided without cost to the employee and at a time and place that is reasonable and convenient to employees. 1910.1027, L1, 4. The employer shall assure that the collecting and handling of biological samples of cadmium in urine, CDU, cadmium in blood, CDB, and beta-2 microglobulin in urine, beta-2M, taken from employees under this section is done in a manner that assures their reliability and that analysis of biological samples of cadmium in urine, CDU, cadmium in blood, CDB, and beta-2 microglobulin in urine, beta-2M, taken from employees under this section is performed in laboratories with demonstrated proficiency for that particular analyte. See Appendix F to this section. 1910.1027, L2, Initial examination. 1910.1027, L2I. The employer shall provide an initial, pre-placement, examination to all employees covered by the medical surveillance program required in paragraph L1I of this section. The examination shall be provided to those employees within 30 days after initial assignment to a job with exposure to cadmium or no later than 90 days after the effective date of this section, whichever date is later. 1910.1027, L2, the initial, pre-placement, medical examination shall include 1910.1027, L2, a detailed medical and work history, with emphasis on past, present, and anticipated future exposure to cadmium, any history of renal, cardiovascular, respiratory, hematopoietic, reproductive, and/or musculoskeletal system dysfunction, current usage of medication with potential nephrotoxic side effects, and smoking history and current status, and 1910.1027, L2, B, biological monitoring that includes the following tests. 1910.1027 L2 2B1 through B3 Cadmium in urine CDU standardized to grams of creatinine G/Cr. Beta-2 microglobulin in urine beta-2M standardized to grams of creatinine G/Cr with pH specified as described in Appendix F to this section. And cadmium in blood CDB standardized to liters of whole blood LWB. 1910.1027 L2 3 Recent examination. An initial examination is not required to be provided if adequate records show that the employee has been examined in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L2(2) of this section within the past 12 months. In that case, such record shall be maintained as part of the employee's medical record, and the prior exam shall be treated as if it were an initial examination for the purposes of paragraphs L3 and 4 of this section. 1910.1027 L3 Actions triggered by initial biological monitoring. 1910.1027 L3I If the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the employee's CDU level to be at or below 3 G/GCR, beta-2M level to be at or below 300 G/GCR, and CDB level to be at or below 5 G/LWB, then 1910.1027 L3I A through B for currently exposed employees who are subject to medical surveillance under paragraph L1IA of this section, the employer shall provide the minimum level of periodic medical surveillance in accordance with the requirements in paragraph L4I of this section. And for previously exposed employees who are subject to medical surveillance under paragraph L1IB of this section, the employer shall provide biological monitoring for CDU, beta-2M, and CDB 1 year after the initial biological monitoring, and then the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraph L4V of this section. 1910.1027 L3(2) For all employees who are subject to medical surveillance under paragraph L1I of this section, if the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the level of CDU to exceed 3 G/GCR, the level of beta-2M to exceed 300 G/GCR, or the level of CDB to exceed 5 G/LWB, the employer shall 1910.1027 L3(2)A within 2 weeks after receipt of biological monitoring results, reassess the employee's occupational exposure to cadmium as follows. 1910.1027 L3(2)A1 through A5. Reassess the employee's work practices and personal hygiene. Re-evaluate the employee's respirator use, if any, and the respirator program. Review the hygiene facilities. Re-evaluate the maintenance and effectiveness of the relevant engineering controls. Assess the employee's smoking history and status. 1910.1027 L3(2)B. Within 30 days after the exposure reassessment, specified in paragraph L3(2)A of this section, take reasonable steps to correct any deficiencies found in the reassessment that may be responsible for the employee's excess exposure to cadmium, and 1910.1027 L3(2)C. Within 90 days after receipt of biological monitoring results, provide a full medical examination to the employee in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L4(2) of this section. After completing the medical examination, the examining physician shall determine in a written medical opinion whether to medically remove the employee. If the physician determines that medical removal is not necessary, then until the employee's CDU level falls to or below 3 G/GCR, beta-2M level falls to or below 300 G/GCR, and CDB level falls to or below 5 G/LWB, the employer shall 1910.1027 L3(2)C1 through C2 provide biological monitoring in accordance with paragraph L2(2)B of this section on a semi-annual basis, and provide annual medical examinations in accordance with paragraph L4(2) of this section. 1910.1027 L3(3) For all employees who were subject to medical surveillance under paragraph L1I of this section, if the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the level of CDU to be in excess of 15 G/GCR, or the level of CDB to be in excess of 15 G/LWB, or the level of beta-2M to be in excess of 1,500 G/GCR, the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraphs L3(2)A-B of this section. Within 90 days after receipt of biological monitoring results, the employer shall provide a full medical examination to the employee in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L4(2) of this section. After completing the medical examination, the examining physician shall determine in a written medical opinion whether to medically remove the employee. However, if the initial biological monitoring results and the biological monitoring results obtained during the medical examination both show that CDU exceeds 15G/GCR, or CDB exceeds 15G/LWB, or beta-2M exceeds 1500G/GCR, and in addition CDU exceeds 3G/GCR or CDB exceeds 5G/liter of whole blood, then the physician shall medically remove the employee from exposure to cadmium at or above the action level. If the second set of biological monitoring results obtained during the medical examination does not show that a mandatory removal trigger level has been exceeded, then the employee is not required to be removed by the mandatory provisions of this paragraph. If the employee is not required to be removed by the mandatory provisions of this paragraph or by the physician's determination, then until the employee's CDU level falls to or below 3G/GCR, beta-2M level falls to or below 300G/GCR and CDB level falls to or below 5G/LWB, the employer shall 1910.1027 L3(3)(a) through C periodically reassess the employee's occupational exposure to cadmium, provide biological monitoring in accordance with paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section on a quarterly basis, and provide semi-annual medical examinations in accordance with paragraph L4(2) of this section. 1910.1027 L3(4) for all employees to whom medical surveillance is provided, beginning on January 1, 1999, and in lieu of paragraphs L3(I)(3) of this section. 1910.1027 L3(4)(a). If the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the employee's CDU level to be at or below 3G/GCR, beta-2M level to be at or below 300G/GCR and CDB level to be at or below 5G/LWB, then for currently exposed employees, the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraph L3(I)(a) of this section, and for previously exposed employees, the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraph L3(I)(b) of this section. 1910.1027 L3(4)(b). If the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the level of CDU to exceed 3G/GCR, the level of beta-2M to exceed 300G/GCR, or the level of CDB to exceed 5G/LWB, the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraphs L3(2)(a)(c) of this section, and 1910.1027 L3(4)(c). If the results of the initial biological monitoring tests show the level of CDU to be in excess of 7G/GCR, or the level of CDB to be in excess of 10G/LWB, or the level of beta-2M to be in excess of 750G/GCR, the employer shall comply with the requirements of paragraphs L3(2)(a)(b) of this section, and, within 90 days after receipt of biological monitoring results, provide a full medical examination to the employee in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L4(2) of this section. After completing the medical examination, the examining physician shall determine in a written medical opinion whether to medically remove the employee. However, if the initial biological monitoring results and the biological monitoring results obtained during the medical examination both show that CDU exceeds 7G/GCR, or CDB exceeds 10G/LWB, or beta-2M exceeds 750G/GCR, and in addition CDU exceeds 3G/GCR or CDB exceeds 5G/liter of whole blood, then the physician shall medically remove the employee from exposure to cadmium at or above the action level. If the second set of biological monitoring results obtained during the medical examination does not show that a mandatory removal trigger level has been exceeded, then the employee is not required to be removed by the mandatory provisions of this paragraph. If the employee is not required to be removed by the mandatory provisions of this paragraph or by the physician's determination, then until the employee's CDU level falls to or below 3G/GCR, beta-2M level falls to or below 300G/GCR and CDB level falls to or below 5G/LWB, the employer shall periodically reassess the employee's occupational exposure to cadmium, provide biological monitoring in accordance with paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section on a quarterly basis, and provide semi-annual medical examinations in accordance with paragraph L4(2) of this section. 1910.1027 L4 Periodic medical surveillance. 1910.1027 L4 I. For each employee who is covered under paragraph L1(I)(a) of this section, the employer shall provide at least the minimum level of periodic medical surveillance, which consists of periodic medical examinations and periodic biological monitoring. A periodic medical examination shall be provided within 1 year after the initial examination required by paragraph L2 of this section and thereafter at least biennially. Biological sampling shall be provided at least annually, either as part of a periodic medical examination or separately as periodic biological monitoring. 1910.1027 L4(2) The periodic medical examination shall include 1910.1027 L4(2)(a) through 1910.1027 L4(2)(i), a detailed medical and work history, or update thereof, with emphasis on past, present and anticipated future exposure to cadmium, smoking history and current status, reproductive history, current use of medications with potential nephrotoxic side effects, any history of renal, cardiovascular, respiratory, hematopoietic, and/or musculoskeletal system dysfunction, and as part of the medical and work history, for employees who wear respirators, questions 3 to 11 and 25 to 32 in Appendix D to this section. A complete physical examination with emphasis on blood pressure, the respiratory system, and the urinary system. A 14-inch by 17-inch or other reasonably sized standard film or digital posterior anterior chest X-ray. After the initial X-ray, the frequency of chest X-rays is to be determined by the examining physician. Pulmonary function tests, including forced vital capacity, FVC, and forced expiratory volume at 1 second, FEV1. Biological monitoring, as required in paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section. Blood analysis, in addition to the analysis required under paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section, including blood urea nitrogen, complete blood count, and serum creatinine. Urinalysis, in addition to the analysis required under paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section, including the determination of albumin, glucose, and total and low molecular weight proteins. For males over 40 years old, prostate palpation, or other at least as effective diagnostic tests, and any additional tests deemed appropriate by the examining physician. 1910.1027 L4(3) Periodic biological monitoring shall be provided in accordance with paragraph L2(2)(b) of this section. 1910.1027 L4(4) If the results of periodic biological monitoring or the results of biological monitoring performed as part of the periodic medical examination showed the level of the employee's CDU, beta-2M, or CDB to be in excess of the levels specified in paragraphs L3, 2, or 3, or, beginning on January 1, 1999, in excess of the levels specified in paragraphs L3, 2, or 4 of this section, the employer shall take the appropriate actions specified in paragraphs L3, 2-4 of this section. 1910.1027 L4(v) For previously exposed employees under paragraph L1(I)(b) of this section. 1910.1027 L4(v)(a) If the employee's levels of CDU did not exceed 3G/GCR, CDB did not exceed 5G/LWB, and beta-2M did not exceed 300G/GCR in the initial biological monitoring tests, and if the results of the follow-up biological monitoring required by paragraph L3(I)(b) of this section 1 year after the initial examination confirm the previous results, the employer may discontinue all periodic medical surveillance for that employee. 1910.1027 L4(v)(b) If the initial biological monitoring results for CDU, CDB, or beta-2M were in excess of the levels specified in paragraph L3(I) of this section, but subsequent biological monitoring results required by paragraph L3(2-4) of this section show that the employee's CDU levels no longer exceed 3G/GCR, CDB levels no longer exceed 5G/LWB, and beta-2M levels no longer exceed 300G/GCR, the employer shall provide biological monitoring for CDU, CDB, and beta-2M 1 year after these most recent biological monitoring results. If the results of the follow-up biological monitoring, specified in this paragraph, confirm the previous results, the employer may discontinue all periodic medical surveillance for that employee. 1910.1027 L. 4 v. C. However, if the results of the follow-up tests specified in paragraph L. 4 v. A. or B. of this section indicate that the level of the employee's CDU, beta-2M, or CDB exceeds these same levels, the employer is required to provide annual medical examinations in accordance with the provisions of paragraph L. 4 2 of this section until the results of biological monitoring are consistently below these levels or the examining physician determines in a written medical opinion that further medical surveillance is not required to protect the employee's health. 1910.1027 L. 4 6. A routine, biennial medical examination is not required to be provided in accordance with paragraphs L. 3 I and L. 4 of this section if adequate medical records show that the employee has been examined in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L. 4 2 of this section within the past 12 months. In that case, such record shall be maintained by the employer as part of the employee's medical record, and the next routine, periodic medical examination shall be made available to the employee within 2 years of the previous examination. 1910.1027 L. 5. Actions triggered by medical examinations. 1910.1027 L. 5 I. If the results of a medical examination carried out in accordance with this section indicate any laboratory or clinical finding consistent with cadmium toxicity that does not require employer action under paragraph L. 2, 3, or 4 of this section, the employer, within 30 days, shall reassess the employee's occupational exposure to cadmium and take the following corrective action until the physician determines they are no longer necessary. 1910.1027 L. 5 I. A. through D. Periodically reassess the employee's work practices and personal hygiene, the employee's respirator use, if any, the employee's smoking history and status, the respiratory protection program, the hygiene facilities, and the maintenance and effectiveness of the relevant engineering controls. Within 30 days after the reassessment, take all reasonable steps to correct the deficiencies found in the reassessment that may be responsible for the employee's excess exposure to cadmium. Provide semi-annual medical re-examinations to evaluate the abnormal clinical signs of cadmium toxicity until the results are normal or the employee is medically removed. And where the results of tests for total proteins in urine are abnormal, provide a more detailed medical evaluation of the toxic effects of cadmium on the employee's renal system. 1910.1027 L. 6. Examination for respirator use. 1910.1027 L. 6 I. To determine an employee's fitness for respirator use, the employer shall provide a medical examination that includes the elements specified in paragraph L. 6 I. A-D of this section. This examination shall be provided prior to the employees being assigned to a job that requires the use of a respirator or no later than 90 days after this section goes into effect, whichever date is later, to any employee without a medical examination within the preceding 12 months that satisfies the requirements of this paragraph. 1910.1027 L. 6 I. A. through D. A detailed medical and work history, or update thereof, with emphasis on past exposure to cadmium, smoking history and current status, any history of renal, cardiovascular, respiratory, hematopoietic, and/or musculoskeletal system dysfunction, a description of the job for which the respirator is required, and questions 3 to 11 and 25 to 32 in Appendix D to this section. A blood pressure test. Biological monitoring of the employee's levels of CDU, CDB, and beta-2M in accordance with the requirements of paragraph L. 2(b) of this section, unless such results already have been obtained within the previous 12 months, and any other test or procedure that the examining physician deems appropriate. 1910.1027 L. 6 2. After reviewing all the information obtained from the medical examination required in paragraph L. 6 I of this section, the physician shall determine whether the employee is fit to wear a respirator. 1910.1027 L. 6 3. Whenever an employee has exhibited difficulty in breathing during a respirator fit test or during use of a respirator, the employer, as soon as possible, shall provide the employee with a periodic medical examination in accordance with paragraph L. 4 2 of this section to determine the employee's fitness to wear a respirator. 1910.1027 L. 6 4. Where the results of the examination required under paragraph L. 6 I. 2 or 3 of this section are abnormal, medical limitation or prohibition of respirator use shall be considered. If the employee is allowed to wear a respirator, the employee's ability to continue to do so shall be periodically evaluated by a physician. 1910.1027 L7 Emergency examinations. 1910.1027 L7 I. In addition to the medical surveillance required in paragraphs L2-6 of this section, the employer shall provide a medical examination as soon as possible to any employee who may have been acutely exposed to cadmium because of an emergency. 1910.1027 L7 2. The examination shall include the requirements of paragraph L4-2 of this section, with emphasis on the respiratory system, other organ systems considered appropriate by the examining physician, and symptoms of acute overexposure, as identified in paragraphs 2B1-2 and 4 of Appendix A to this section. 1910.1027 L8 Termination of employment examination. 1910.1027 L8 I. At termination of employment, the employer shall provide a medical examination in accordance with paragraph L4-2 of this section, including a chest X-ray, to any employee to whom at any prior time the employer was required to provide medical surveillance under paragraphs L1I or L7 of this section. However, if the last examination satisfied the requirements of paragraph L4-2 of this section and was less than 6 months prior to the date of termination, no further examination is required unless otherwise specified in paragraphs L3 or L5 of this section. 1910.1027 L8-2. However, for employees covered by paragraph L1IB of this section, if the employer has discontinued all periodic medical surveillance under paragraph L4V of this section, no termination of employment medical examination is required. 1910.1027 L9 Information provided to the physician. The employer shall provide the following information to the examining physician. 1910.1027 L9 I through V. A copy of this standard and appendices. A description of the affected employee's former, current, and anticipated duties as they relate to the employee's occupational exposure to cadmium. The employee's former, current, and anticipated future levels of occupational exposure to cadmium. A description of any personal protective equipment, including respirators, used or to be used by the employee, including when and for how long the employee has used that equipment, and relevant results of previous biological monitoring and medical examinations. 1910.1027 L10 Physician's written medical opinion. 1910.1027 L10 I. The employer shall promptly obtain a written medical opinion from the examining physician for each medical examination performed on each employee. This written opinion shall contain 1910.1027 L10 I.A. through E. The physician's diagnosis for the employee. The physician's opinion as to whether the employee has any detected medical conditions that would place the employee at increased risk of material impairment to health from further exposure to cadmium, including any indications of potential cadmium toxicity. The results of any biological or other testing or related evaluations that directly assess the employee's absorption of cadmium. Any recommended removal from or limitation on the activities or duties of the employee or on the employee's use of personal protective equipment, such as respirators. A statement that the physician has clearly and carefully explained to the employee the results of the medical examination, including all biological monitoring results and any medical conditions related to cadmium exposure that require further evaluation or treatment, and any limitation on the employee's diet or use of medications. 1910.1027 L10-2. The employer promptly shall obtain a copy of the results of any biological monitoring provided by an employer to an employee independently of a medical examination under paragraphs L2 and L4 of this section, and, in lieu of a written medical opinion, an explanation sheet explaining those results. 1910.1027 L10-3. The employer shall instruct the physician not to reveal orally or in the written medical opinion given to the employer specific findings or diagnoses unrelated to occupational exposure to cadmium. 1910.1027 L11 Medical Removal Protection MRP. 1910.1027 L11 I General. 1910.1027 L11 I A through E. The employer shall temporarily remove an employee from work where there is excess exposure to cadmium on each occasion that medical removal is required under paragraph L3, L4, or L6 of this section, and on each occasion that a physician determines in a written medical opinion that the employee should be removed from such exposure. The physician's determination may be based on biological monitoring results, inability to wear a respirator, evidence of illness, other signs or symptoms of cadmium-related dysfunction or disease, or any other reason deemed medically sufficient by the physician. The employer shall medically remove an employee in accordance with paragraph L11 of this section regardless of whether at the time of removal a job is available into which the removed employee may be transferred. Whenever an employee is medically removed under paragraph L11 of this section, the employer shall transfer the removed employee to a job where the exposure to cadmium is within the permissible levels specified in that paragraph as soon as one becomes available. For any employee who is medically removed under the provisions of paragraph L11I of this section, the employer shall provide follow-up biological monitoring in accordance with L22B of this section at least every 3 months and follow-up medical examinations semi-annually at least every 6 months until in a written medical opinion the examining physician determines that either the employee may be returned to his/her former job status as specified under paragraph L11(4)(v) of this section, or the employee must be permanently removed from excess cadmium exposure. The employer may not return an employee who has been medically removed for any reason to his/her former job status until a physician determines in a written medical opinion that continued medical removal is no longer necessary to protect the employee's health. 1910.1027 L11(2), where an employee is found unfit to wear a respirator under paragraph L6(2) of this section, the employer shall remove the employee from work where exposure to cadmium is above the PL. 1910.1027 L11(3), where removal is based on any reason other than the employee's inability to wear a respirator, the employer shall remove the employee from work where exposure to cadmium is at or above the action level. 1910.1027 L11(4), except as specified in paragraph L11(v) of this section, no employee who was removed because his/her level of CDU, CDB, and/or beta-2M exceeded the medical removal trigger levels in paragraph L3 or L4 of this section may be returned to work with exposure to cadmium at or above the action level until the employee's levels of CDU fall to or below 3G/GCR, CDB falls to or below 5G/LWB, and beta-2M falls to or below 300G/GCR. 1910.1027 L11(v). However, when in the examining physician's opinion continued exposure to cadmium will not pose an increased risk to the employee's health and there are special circumstances that make continued medical removal an inappropriate remedy, the physician shall fully discuss these matters with the employee, and then in a written determination may return a worker to his/her former job status despite what would otherwise be unacceptably high biological monitoring results. Thereafter, the returned employee shall continue to be provided with medical surveillance as if he/she were still on medical removal until the employee's levels of CDU fall to or below 3G/GCR, CDB falls to or below 5G/LWB, and beta-2M falls to or below 300G/GCR. 1910.1027 L11(6), where an employer, although not required by paragraph L11I-3 of this section to do so, removes an employee from exposure to cadmium or otherwise places limitations on an employee due to the effects of cadmium exposure on the employee's medical condition, the employer shall provide the same medical removal protection benefits to that employee under paragraph L12 of this section as would have been provided had the removal been required under paragraph L11I-3 of this section. 1910.1027 L12 Medical Removal Protection Benefits MRPB. 1910.1027 L12I The employer shall provide MRPB for up to a maximum of 18 months to an employee each time and while the employee is temporarily medically removed under paragraph L11 of this section. 1910.1027 L12(2) For purposes of this section, the requirement that the employer provide MRPB means that the employer shall maintain the total normal earnings, seniority, and all other employee rights and benefits of the removed employee, including the employee's Right to his/her former job status, as if the employee had not been removed from the employee's job or otherwise medically limited. 1910.1027, L. 12, 3, where, after 18 months on medical removal because of elevated biological monitoring results, the employee's monitoring results have not declined to a low enough level to permit the employee to be returned to his/her former job status. 1910.1027, L. 12, 3, A. The employer shall make available to the employee a medical examination pursuant to this section in order to obtain a final medical determination as to whether the employee may be returned to his/her former job status or must be permanently removed from excess cadmium exposure. And 1910.1027, L. 12, 3, B. The employer shall assure that the final medical determination indicates whether the employee may be returned to his/her former job status and what steps, if any, should be taken to protect the employee's health. 1910.1027, L. 12, 4. The employer may condition the provision of MRPB upon the employee's participation in medical surveillance, provided in accordance with this section. 1910.1027, L. 13. Multiple physician review. 1910.1027, L. 13, I. If the employer selects the initial physician to conduct any medical examination or consultation provided to an employee under this section, the employee may designate a second physician to 1910.1027, L. 13, A through B. Review any findings, determinations, or recommendations of the initial physician, and conduct such examinations, consultations, and laboratory tests as the second physician deems necessary to facilitate this review. 1910.1027, L. 13, 2. The employer shall promptly notify an employee of the right to seek a second medical opinion after each occasion that an initial physician provided by the employer conducts a medical examination or consultation pursuant to this section. The employer may condition its participation in, and payment for, multiple physician review upon the employee doing the following within 15 days after receipt of this notice, or receipt of the initial physician's written opinion, whichever is later. 1910.1027, L. 13, 2, A, and B. Informing the employer that he or she intends to seek a medical opinion, and initiating steps to make an appointment with a second physician. 1910.1027, L. 13, 3. If the findings, determinations, or recommendations of the second physician differ from those of the initial physician, then the employer and the employee shall assure that efforts are made for the two physicians to resolve any disagreement. 1910.1027, L. 13, 4. If the two physicians have been unable to quickly resolve their disagreement, then the employer and the employee, through their respective physicians, shall designate a third physician to 1910.1027, L. 13, 4, A, and B. Review any findings, determinations, or recommendations of the other two physicians, and conduct such examinations, consultations, laboratory tests, and discussions with the other two physicians as the third physician deems necessary to resolve the disagreement among them. 1910.1027, L. 13, v. The employer shall act consistently with the findings, determinations, and recommendations of the third physician, unless the employer and the employee reach an agreement that is consistent with the recommendations of at least one of the other two physicians. 1910.1027, L. 14. Alternate physician determination. The employer and an employee or designated employee representative may agree upon the use of any alternate form of physician determination in lieu of the multiple physician review provided by paragraph L. 13 of this section, so long as the alternative is expeditious and at least as protective of the employee. 1910.1027, L. 15. Information the employer must provide the employee. 1910.1027, L. 15, I, through 3. The employer shall provide a copy of the physician's written medical opinion to the examined employee within 2 weeks after receipt thereof. The employer shall provide the employee with a copy of the employee's biological monitoring results and an explanation sheet explaining the results within 2 weeks after receipt thereof. Within 30 days after a request by an employee, the employer shall provide the employee with the information the employer is required to provide the examining physician under paragraph L. 9 of this section. 1910.1027, L. 16, Reporting. In addition to other medical events that are required to be reported on the OSHA Form No. 200. The employer shall report any abnormal condition or disorder caused by occupational exposure to cadmium associated with employment as specified in Chapter V.E. of the Reporting Guidelines for Occupational Injuries and Illnesses. 1910.1027 M. Communication of cadmium hazards to employees. 1910.1027 M1. Hazard communication. General. 1910.1027 M1 I through 3. Chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers shall comply with all requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, Section 1910.1200, for cadmium. In classifying the hazards of cadmium, at least the following hazards are to be addressed: cancer, lung effects, kidney effects, and acute toxicity effects. Employers shall include cadmium in the Hazard Communication Program established to comply with the HCS, Section 1910.1200. Employers shall ensure that each employee has access to labels on containers of cadmium and to safety data sheets, and is trained in accordance with the requirements of HCS in paragraph M4 of this section. 1910.1027 M2. Warning signs. 1910.1027 M2 I. Warning signs shall be provided and displayed in regulated areas. In addition, warning signs shall be posted at all approaches to regulated areas so that an employee may read the signs and take necessary protective steps before entering the area. 1910.1027 M2 Warning signs required by paragraph M2 I of this section shall bear the following legend: danger. Cadmium may cause cancer. Causes damage to lungs and kidneys. Wear respiratory protection in this area. Authorized personnel only. 1910.1027 M2 3. The employer shall ensure that signs required by this paragraph M2 are illuminated, cleaned, and maintained as necessary so that the legend is readily visible. 1910.1027 M2 4. Prior to June 1, 2016, employers may use the following legend in lieu of that specified in paragraph M2 of this section: danger. Cadmium. Cancer hazard. Can cause lung and kidney disease. Authorized personnel only. Respirators required in this area. 1910.1027 M3. Warning labels. 1910.1027 M3 I. Shipping and storage containers containing cadmium or cadmium compounds shall bear appropriate warning labels, as specified in paragraph M1 of this section. 1910.1027 M3 2. The warning labels for containers of contaminated protective clothing, equipment, waste, scrap, or debris shall include at least the following information: danger. Contains cadmium. May cause cancer. Causes damage to lungs and kidneys. Avoid creating dust. 1910.1027 M3 3. Prior to June 1, 2015, employers may include the following information on shipping and storage containers containing cadmium, cadmium compounds, or cadmium-contaminated clothing, equipment, waste, scrap, or debris in lieu of the labeling requirements specified in paragraphs M1I and M3 2 of this section. Danger. Contains cadmium. Cancer hazard. Avoid creating dust. Can cause lung and kidney disease. 1910.1027 M3 4. Where feasible, installed cadmium products shall have a visible label or other indication that cadmium is present. 1910.1027 M4. Employee information and training. 1910.1027 M4 I. The employer shall train each employee who is potentially exposed to cadmium in accordance with the requirements of this section. The employer shall institute a training program, ensure employee participation in the program, and maintain a record of the contents of such program. 1910.1027 M4 2. Training shall be provided prior to or at the time of initial assignment to a job involving potential exposure to cadmium and at least annually thereafter. 1910.1027 M4 3. The employer shall make the training program understandable to the employee and shall assure that each employee is informed of the following: 1910.1027 M4 3 A through H. The health hazards associated with cadmium exposure, with special attention to the information incorporated in Appendix A to this section. The quantity, location, manner of use, release, and storage of cadmium in the workplace and the specific nature of operations that could result in exposure to cadmium, especially exposures above the PL. The engineering controls and work practices associated with the employee's job assignment. The measures employees can take to protect themselves from exposure to cadmium, including modification of such habits as smoking and personal hygiene, and specific procedures the employer has implemented to protect employees from exposure to cadmium, such as appropriate work practices, emergency procedures, and the provision of personal protective equipment. The purpose, proper selection, fitting, proper use, and limitations of respirators and protective clothing. The purpose and a description of the medical surveillance program required by paragraph L of this section. The contents of this section and its appendices, and the employee's rights of access to records under section 1910.1020 E and G. 1910.1027 M 4 additional access to information in training program and materials. 1910.1027 M 4 A and B. The employer shall make a copy of this section and its appendices readily available without cost to all affected employees and shall provide a copy if requested. The employer shall provide to the Assistant Secretary or the Director, upon request, all materials relating to the employee information and the training program. 1910.1027 N. Record keeping. 1910.1027 N. 1. Exposure monitoring. 1910.1027 N. 1 I. The employer shall establish and keep an accurate record of all air monitoring for cadmium in the workplace. 1910.1027 N. 1 2. This record shall include at least the following information. 1910.1027 N. 1 2 A through E. The monitoring date, duration, and results in terms of an 8-hour TWA of each sample taken. The name and job classification of the employees monitored and of all other employees whose exposures the monitoring is intended to represent. A description of the sampling and analytical methods used in evidence of their accuracy. The type of respiratory protective device, if any, worn by the monitored employee. A notation of any other conditions that might have affected the monitoring results. 1910.1027 N. 1 3. The employer shall maintain this record for at least 30 years, in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1027 N. 2. Objective data for exemption from requirement for initial monitoring. 1910.1027 N. 2 I and 2. For purposes of this section, objective data are information demonstrating that a particular product or material containing cadmium or a specific process, operation, or activity involving cadmium cannot release dust or fumes in concentrations at or above the action level even under the worst-case release conditions. Objective data can be obtained from an industry-wide study or from laboratory product test results from manufacturers of cadmium-containing products or materials. The data the employer uses from an industry-wide survey must be obtained under workplace conditions closely resembling the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operations. The employer shall establish and maintain a record of the objective data for at least 30 years. 1910.1027 N. 3. Medical surveillance. 1910.1027 N. 3 I. The employer shall establish and maintain an accurate record for each employee covered by medical surveillance under paragraph L. 1 I of this section. 1910.1027 N. 3 2. The record shall include at least the following information about the employee. 1910.1027 N. 3 2 A through E. Name and description of the duties. A copy of the physician's written opinions and an explanation sheet for biological monitoring results. A copy of the medical history, and the results of any physical examination and all test results that are required to be provided by this section, including biological tests, X-rays, pulmonary function tests, etc., or that have been obtained to further evaluate any condition that might be related to cadmium exposure. The employee's medical symptoms that might be related to exposure to cadmium, and a copy of the information provided to the physician as required by paragraph L. 9(2)(v) of this section. 1910.1027 N. 3 The employer shall assure that this record is maintained for the duration of employment plus 30 years, in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1027 N. 4. Availability. 1910.1027 N. 4. I. Except as otherwise provided for in this section, access to all records required to be maintained by paragraphs N. 1 through 3 of this section shall be in accordance with the provisions of 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1027 N. 4. 2. Within 15 days after a request, the employer shall make an employee's medical records required to be kept by paragraph N. 3 of this section available for examination and copying to the subject employee, to designated representatives, to anyone having the specific written consent of the subject employee, and after the employee's death or incapacitation, to the employee's family members. 1910.1027 O. Observation of monitoring. 1910.1027 O.1. Employee observation. The employer shall provide affected employees or their designated representatives an opportunity to observe any monitoring of employee exposure to cadmium. 1910.1027 O.2. Observation procedures. When observation of monitoring requires entry into an area where the use of protective clothing or equipment is required, the employer shall provide the observer with that clothing and equipment and shall assure that the observer uses such clothing and equipment and complies with all other applicable safety and health procedures. 1910.1027 P. Dates. 1910.1027 P. 1. Effective date. This section shall become effective December 14, 1992. 1910.1027 P. 2. Startup dates. All obligations of this section commence on the effective date except as follows. 1910.1027 P. 2. I. Exposure monitoring. Except for small businesses, 19 or fewer employees, initial monitoring required by paragraph D. 2 of this section shall be completed as soon as possible and in any event no later than 60 days after the effective date of this standard. For small businesses, initial monitoring required by paragraph D. 2 of this section shall be completed as soon as possible and in any event no later than 120 days after the effective date of this standard. 1910.1027 P. 2. Regulated areas. Except for small business, defined under paragraph P. 2. I of this section, regulated areas required to be established by paragraph E of this section shall be set up as soon as possible after the results of exposure monitoring are known and in any event no later than 90 days after the effective date of this section. For small businesses, regulated areas required to be established by paragraph E of this section shall be set up as soon as possible after the results of exposure monitoring are known and in any event no later than 150 days after the effective date of this section. 1910.1027 P. 2. 3. Respiratory protection. Except for small businesses, defined under paragraph P. 2. I of this section, respiratory protection required by paragraph G of this section shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 90 days after the effective date of this section. For small businesses, respiratory protection required by paragraph G of this section shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 150 days after the effective date of this section. 1910.1027 P. 2. 4. Compliance program. Written compliance programs required by paragraph F. 2 of this section shall be completed and available for inspection and copying as soon as possible and in any event no later than 1 year after the effective date of this section. 1910.1027 P. 2. The methods of compliance. The engineering controls required by paragraph F. 1 of this section shall be implemented as soon as possible and in any event no later than 2 years after the effective date of this section. Work practice controls shall be implemented as soon as possible. Work practice controls that are directly related to engineering controls to be implemented in accordance with the compliance plan shall be implemented as soon as possible after such engineering controls are implemented. 1910.1027 P. 2. 6. Hygiene and lunchroom facilities. 1910.1027 P. 2. 6. A and B. Hand washing facilities, permanent or temporary, shall be provided in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.141 D1 and 2 as soon as possible and in any event no later than 60 days after the effective date of this section. Change rooms, showers, and lunchroom facilities shall be completed as soon as possible and in any event no later than 1 year after the effective date of this section. 1910.1027 P2-7 Employee Information and Training. Except for small businesses, defined under paragraph P2I of this section, employee information and training required by paragraph M4 of this section shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 90 days after the effective date of this standard. For small businesses, employee information and training required by paragraph M4 of this standard shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 180 days after the effective date of this standard. 1910.1027 P2-8 Medical Surveillance. Except for small businesses, defined under paragraph P2I of this section, initial medical examinations required by paragraph L of this section shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 90 days after the effective date of this standard. For small businesses, initial medical examinations required by paragraph L of this section shall be provided as soon as possible and in any event no later than 180 days after the effective date of this standard. 1910.1027 Q. Appendices. Except where portions of appendices A, B, D, E, and F to this section are expressly incorporated in requirements of this section, these appendices are purely informational and are not intended to create any additional obligations not otherwise imposed or to detract from any existing obligations.